Good evening, everybody. For those of you who don't know, my name is Gord. I'm the City Councillor for Parkdale High Park, Ward 4 in the City of Toronto, and this is my annual Budget Town Hall. Before we get started, I'd like to do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the land we are meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. So I'm just going to run a little bit through our agenda for tonight. A few sort of practical matters about how you can participate. I'll introduce our panel, and then I'll start with a brief overview on the city's budget. So first of all, the way we're going to do this is I'm going to give about a 15-20 minute overview of the city's budget. Then we're going to have presentations from 4 really smart people who are closely tied with Ward 4 and some of the bigger city issues that affect us all. We're going to be hearing first from Professor Tricia Wood, who's the co-founder of the University of York City Institute and is a member of Code Red TO, which is one of Toronto's preeminent transit organizations. We're going to hear from Abigail Doris, who's with the Toronto Community for Better Child Care Coalition. We're hoping soon to have M.A. Ma from the Toronto Environmental Alliance join us. We have Victor Willis, who's the Executive Director of the Parkdale Activity Recreation Centre and one of Toronto's leading thinkers and activists on issues of housing and homelessness and rebuilding lives. So that'll be our panelist. And now I'm going to launch into sort of an overview. Oh no, sorry, I have to tell you the rules. So because we have a lot of people joining us tonight, it's not possible to get everybody all on one screen. So we have 2 groups of people who are the panelists, and we also have a group of people who are the community members at large who are going to be participating. If you're a community member, we won't be able to see you, but if you have questions later on, we may be able to unmute you so you can ask your questions. If you have questions, probably the easiest thing to do is if you look at the bottom of your screen, there's a section that has 3 dots. You can click on that and type questions into a chat feature. Dusha and Chris from my office will be monitoring that and capturing those questions so that myself and the panelists can make sure that we have a chance to address any questions that you have. I'm also going to ask all the panelists, including you, Tricia, to make sure that you're muted so that we don't get any feedback during the presentations. And with that, I'm now going to pull up my notes on the city's budget, which I have got there. Okay. So the 2021 budget for the City of Toronto is unlike any budget we've ever done before. And I'm not going to follow my usual process of going through a series of charts and graphs department by department and talking about very specific issues in the budget. Because of COVID, the city's budget is so completely different than anything we've ever done before, that style of presentation won't work. Here's why. The City of Toronto generally has a budget of about 14 or 15 billion dollars. And of that, about 1/3 is stuff that we have direct control over. We raise our own taxes to pay for it. We set our own program targets, and away we go. This year, because revenues are down all across all the systems we run, including the TTC, to the tune of several $billions, about a third of what we normally do, we have no way to pay for. A third of our discretionary costs, we simply can't square the revenues and the cost of delivering programs. So this budget builds into it an assumption that the provincial and federal governments are going to give us bailout money so that we can continue to deliver those services. We have said that we need about $1.6 billion in that bailout money from the federal and provincial governments, and we currently have in hand just a little bit more than half of that amount. And I want to be clear, most of that money is coming from the federal government. We don't yet have it all in hand, though. There's an amount of money, $865 million, that city staff have said, we're just going to assume we get it. The federal and provincial governments haven't committed it, but we're going to assume we get it. And if we don't get it, what we will do is stop spending on a number of the longer term projects we have to maintain our facilities, our road, our transit system, and to do the ongoing repairs that we need to keep those systems operating. So that's the big picture. We've put forward a budget for council to consider that doesn't balance and relies on the federal and provincial government to give us a bunch of money that they haven't promised yet. And if we don't get that, we're going to stop doing the normal work we would do to keep the city's infrastructure healthy for 2022 and 23 and so on. That's the first thing we all have to have in mind as we look at our budget. The second thing we have to have in mind is that the pandemic has made it very, very clear that a number of the public services that we deliver leave people behind. We have seen that Black, Indigenous, and racialized Torontonians are more likely to get COVID and are more likely to suffer the economic impacts that COVID is putting on all of us. We have seen that our housing system is in a state of complete collapse. Right now, between our shelter system and encampments, something around 6,000 people who live in the city of Toronto are without homes on any given night. And we do not have a plan to get all 6,000 people housed this year. We also are quite certain that with the provincial policies around evictions and the failure of several provincial systems like the mental health system and the criminal justice system, that 6,000 person number is going to grow and grow by a lot. We also know that women are being hit particularly hard economically and in terms of the managing their work-life balance in the city of Toronto, as the school system and the childcare system both fail to provide safe places for kids to go during the day. We know that our transit system has had to jettison plans to buy enough buses, streetcars, and subway cars that we will be able to safely transport people this year and in the coming years. We know that people with low incomes are more likely to get the COVID disease and more likely to have long-term financial problems because of the economic consequences of COVID. All of these things that I've just described to you are not part of that $865 million that we have asked the federal and provincial governments to fund us for. All the budget that we are doing will fund is a reduced version of the services that we had before COVID. At the same time as we are asking the federal and provincial governments to come up with money, The mayor and the public service of Toronto have come up with a plan to do our share by cutting over $500 million from previous year's budgets. We've done that mostly by asking people to take voluntary layoffs, by freezing staff hiring, and by reducing certain programs within the City of Toronto. And the budget we're being asked to approve actually continues to underfund the services from the level we were at before the pandemic by that $500 million. In other words, this is not a budget that imagines building back better. It's a budget that imagines just merely building back a little bit below the level we used to be at a city, as a city. The thing that is shocking to my mind is, while we have these multiple overlapping crises of women and young families not being able to secure childcare, people not being able to secure housing, people not being able to get safely on public transportation, people continuing to be excluded from participating in our society because they're Black, Indigenous, or racialized. The problems that we have seen with the way we police instead of providing mental health services. All of these overlapping crises, while we're doing a few little things around the margins, are not central to the budget that is being put in front of Toronto City Council. So this year, I can't come to you with the regular nuts and bolts budget conversation that we have every year. This year, I think we need to do something different. We need to recognize that there has to be a new deal, not just for cities, but for the people who live in cities. And if the Toronto Public Service and the mayor are unprepared to give us a budget that addresses those needs, then we need to start building a political movement that says we have no option as a city but to fight for that better budget, to fight for that better future, to fight for a future where people who, after years of austerity, have been pushed to the social margins are welcomed back into the city and treated as equal participants in our future, and that we're prepared to build the public services that get us there. That's the conversation I think we have to have as a community this year. And that's why I've invited these really wonderful panelists who are with us tonight to talk about what they see in the issues that they work on. So I want to thank everyone who's joined us. We're now going to go through the panelist presentations. Each panelist is going to get about 5 minutes, and then we're going to have sort of a chat amongst ourselves for another few minutes after that. And then we will open it up for a discussion with everyone who's here tonight. And again, if you have questions or thoughts as we're going through it, please put them into the chat as we're going so we don't lose them and we get a chance to come make sure your questions and comments are taken. So first, I'm going to turn it over to Victor to talk a little bit about his file and his concerns around housing, homelessness, and rebuilding lives in Ward 4 and across the city. Victor, take it away.
Thank you so much, Gord, and thank you to all of the panelists. As Gord has outlined, and I've actually heard Gord, I guess at a previous meeting where he outlined some of the challenges to the budget, and so I'm not as my jaw isn't on the floor today, although it was previously. And I think that one of the things about housing is that for anybody who may have had the privilege to invest in housing, is that you understand that it's an investment. And it's something that you can't pay for all at once, but that you can, in fact, that if you make the investment over 25 or 30 years, you have a place to live. And in fact, at some point, that investment pays off, or at least it's available to us. So what's interesting, when I did a quick sort of search on the numbers in Toronto, there are 2 million, in 2017, there were about 2.1 million people who there were 2.1 million private occupied dwellings, and so that could be condos and detached houses and semi-detached houses and rental apartments, etc. 39% are single detached houses, and another 29% are apartments. But what we now know is that if you start to look at the data, the number of apartment buildings in the city of Toronto is 627, almost 628,000 units. Toronto Community Housing has 60,000 units. And if we add in all of the other not-for-profits, you might get up to about 75,000 units of housing. And that's just over 10% of all of these other units that might be accumulated in the city of Toronto. And most of these would then be, deeply affordable for people who are very much at who have a fixed income. The city also tells us that we have sort of people living at the poverty line or below across the city at actually a larger percent. So just the numbers don't add up. And then, of course, as Gord identified, the evictions that are happening and the fact that until recently there wasn't a moratorium, and even though there's a moratorium, it just means that the sheriff won't come. It doesn't mean that they actually can't process your eviction. It just means that they're not going to come and kick you out of your unit. It means that we're at a very real sort of challenge. And this, of course, has led to the numbers that Gord's identified. I think that 6,000 people who were homeless on any given night in the shelter system, et cetera, might be a conservative number, and never to suggest that you're a conservative, Gord, but that's a rather conservative number. And so, and anybody who, if you've been out of your home to go to a store or do whatever it is in your basic needs, or if you're an essential worker going to work, it's been no surprise that you see people on the streets. The other thing that, of course, the crisis that happened before the pandemic hit us was the crisis of the cost of housing in this city. And, a year ago, the average rent for a one bedroom was probably cresting, $2,000, $2,100. As of January of this year, the latest average is $1,832 for a one bedroom, and that's the average. So we also know that incomes are nowhere near in this city when we take a look at where our demographics are as far as how much money people have and what they can afford for rent. It doesn't add up. And this gap is getting bigger and bigger. So we really do need to be thinking, and we need to be pushing Gord and his colleagues on council and the mayor that we need investments. We can continue to pay. I think that when I was looking at Gord, you had some background documents that I think are part of city files that talk a bit about some of the investments Shelter Support and Housing is making and some of the other investments that are being made for a shelter bed on any given night. And of course, I think it's about 3 times the cost of a supportive housing unit, and maybe 4 times the cost of an affordable housing unit. The real difference here is where we want to spend our money. And what we really need to be doing is investing. And what we need to be doing, so, a couple of years ago, Gord, you were part of a group of us who were questioning at one of these budget town halls or subsequent to one, the investment in the Gardiner Expressway. And there was about $2 billion that the city had decided to invest in the Gardiner Expressway. I think that, and of course the question for us from a housing point of view is, well, if you can invest in the Gardiner Expressway, and I'm interested in Patricia's comments on that later, but the real issue here is, why wouldn't we be making a similar investment in housing? Yes, we know that the provincial government right now doesn't seem to be as clear a partner as the federal government. Even the federal government is having some difficulty getting the money to the city. So we're seeing delays in projects that we're proposing to Ward 4. And many of our partners across the city are proposing similar projects that would be making a very real dent in the number of affordable and supportive housing units in the city. so I guess that the real opportunity both is, how do you bring in some more revenue? And of course, that could be a modest tax increase. You could also use things like housing bonds. There are probably a variety of tools, as well as making a sort of a capital investment as opposed to some of the operating dollars that you were missing this year. So I really see these as some of the tools. On any given day, and I guess over the last few days, it should really be no surprise that it's pretty damn cold out there, and anybody who doesn't have a place and doesn't have a shelter bed, our workers. We run a drop-in center, and we see people who are homeless every day. We have workers who are going out and supporting people in encampments, and that's no way to live. It's no way for anybody to be surviving in this city. And when it's minus 20 with the wind chill, it's unfathomable. We can do better, but I think that, Gord, the challenge for you and the rest of your colleagues is to really be pushing that this is not a moment for building back sort of good, less good than we had. It's actually a chance to build back better, and that means some, I think, remarkable investments that are required, whether it's purchasing hotels, which of course you've got a short-term, there's a short-term rental for the Novotel, which is great. That's 200 units of most recently that are available for people who are homeless. But of course, we probably need 2,000 units. And so we're once again at about 10% of what we need. The situation is very dire. We have, when I was looking at the housing wait list, so here's, once again, the housing wait list is what, 110,000 households on it? And for 60,000 units. Well, that's essentially, you're telling people who are waiting, you're never going to get in, or you're going to be a decade or two older when you finally get, when your name finally comes up. I just strongly think that the only way out of this is to make a huge and concerted pitch that we need to move this out of sort of our operating challenges, which won't go away, but to make the kinds of investments that are required, because they save us money. Housing saves us money, and there's no other way to put it. And I don't know if MA's on yet, but I know that from an environmental point of view, some of the biggest, the other piece is that if we can actually put it into the realm where groups who are not trying to extract wealth from that housing, but in fact are investing in it, so not for profits, they're going to be figuring out ways to make them more energy efficient, and they're, of course, less greenhouse gas and better for the environment, and also reducing utility costs. So I'll stop there, Gord. I think that's covered most of what you might want to hear.
Great. Thanks so much, Victor. And don't go away. I'm sure we'll have more to talk about in a few minutes. I'm going to pick on Tricia next. Tricia, I've already introduced you, but if you could say a couple of words at the start, sort of about your role in transportation policy in the City of Toronto, and what you'd like to see. What would a real good city budget do for transportation in the City of Toronto?
Thanks, Gord. And I want to add my thanks for the invitation to join this amazing panel. I do research on cities, and particularly mobility, and I also, as Gord noted in my intro, am a member of a transit advocacy group, Code Red TO, that's been studying pretty much every aspect of transportation in the City of Toronto and in comparison to other places. And I think what I want to talk about picks up on a number of the themes that Victor already identified, which is that this is not a moment to sort of put it back together with duct tape. This is a moment to recognize how the status quo was before the pandemic and how viciously the pandemic has exacerbated the gaps. And I think the housing question speaks to it. I want to make a pitch, I guess, basically for why we also need a similar kind of investment in transit. Public transit and other forms of basically non-private automobile mobility, so infrastructure for pedestrians and cycling, for example, are going to be absolutely essential to the recovery. And if I can think of a stronger way to say that, I mean, as in there will be no economic recovery if we do not invest in transit. And I also want to make a pitch, and I think this is echoing the language of Gord and Victor as well, that this is also not just an opportunity for like a one-time only deal, but it really needs to be a moment where we rethink the way we have structured funding transit. And it's particularly important on the way the basic operating budget is supported and the way in which the state of good budget is funded or actually in fact not funded. So this is really an opportunity not just to ask for more money, but to have a rethink about the way in which we do this so that we're in a less fragile situation going forward. One of the ways I always put this in terms of trying to understand how important transit is to cities and their economies and everybody's well-being within them is to think about it in terms of like your circulatory system, that no matter what part of your body might be ailing, if your circulatory system shuts down, everything else will. You may have heard, I've certainly run into, if you're ever in like rural areas, the way city folks are dismissed as not knowing how to do anything. You know, they can't really take care of themselves. They're not self-sufficient in the same way that rural people are. And that's absolutely true. And the reason, but it's for a good reason, which is that urban economies are intentionally, well, they're successful because they are interdependent, which is to say that instead of being, you know, individuals who are self-sufficient, like in cities generally, we don't grow our own food except in very limited amounts. You know, we don't provide a lot of services. We don't repair stuff ourselves in the same way that you find in rural economies. But what that enables people to do is spend all of their time specializing in the one thing that they do, employment and a few other hobbies. And because someone like me, for example, can spend all of her time specializing in research on the city and teaching other people about research in the city, it gives me a lot of time to get really good at it. And so what you get in a city are a whole bunch of specialized people who rely on other people to get things done. What that means is that everybody has to move every single day in order to meet their basic needs. They're not all in their household, they have to move. And that's your basic needs, whether it means getting to your job or buying food or caring for your family and friends or what have you, recreation, everything. You have to move in a city. A city that doesn't move, right, its economy fails, and everybody's well-being, social well-being also fails. So when we're going from a place like where we are now, if we don't, you know, improve the city's mobility, we will not recover from the economic damage that we're currently undergoing. And that the particular impact of that economic damage, as both Gord and Victor have already spoken to, is having a bipolar effect, right? That there are people at the upper echelons of income who are able to work from home. They're still getting paid. In some cases, they're saving money and coming out ahead. And then other communities are really, really suffering. And the impact is viciously uneven. So in order to repair the economy, it can't be this sort of generalized thing. It has to be targeted and focused. And one of the things that we know about transit and the way that it impacts an urban economy is one of the best things it does is it improves economic participation. That when you improve mass transit, you improve the participation of people generally at the lower end of income, people who have a harder time entering the workforce, sometimes for direct access reasons, and sometimes because they have other places that they also need to get to, like childcare or food on the way home or so on. You improve their mobility, you improve their participation in the economy. So a transit plan is also always in a city an economic plan. And when you're facing the kind of economic recovery that we need right now, it's an absolutely irreplaceable part of it. But a transit plan is also a social justice plan, in part because of the last point I mentioned about who really benefits from improved mobility, but also because transit is disproportionately ridden by people who are, for example, right now, still having to go to a workplace. And they are not the people working in the financial center. The ridership that has really collapsed is the subway ridership to the business core. That is where the biggest downfall is. The bus ridership from more remote, or the outer regions of the city, from people, as I said, have no choice but to get to work, the essential workers that we're all relying on, but who are disproportionately women, who are disproportionately racialized members of the city. These are the folks who really rely on it and will benefit greatly. And we have to target their needs, not just develop a plan that includes them. We have to prioritize the needs of people who are most affected by this pandemic negatively and who are most reliant on the subway and the buses and the streetcars. And finally, transit is also an irreplaceable part of a climate plan. Transportation is one of the largest components of our contributions to CO2 emissions. And we have to have a much more ambitious plan than we do now to move people out of cars. And we're at this tipping point where if we don't actually champion and invest and build in transit, people are going to make the decision right now, as mobility kind of restores, to drive instead, those who have the possibility of doing so. We can't afford that. We can't afford it. There's a space, but we really can't afford it if we're going to have any kind of a serious climate plan. So investing in transit is going to touch on a number of critical issues that are part of, but also separate from an economic recovery. But if we're really talking about building, right, not patching, but building back better, it means really addressing how inadequate everything was beforehand. The last thing I want to quickly say is the state of good repair budget of the TTC is one of the most painful parts of the budget that I read every single year. So it's not a new problem, but this problem has intensified again with the crisis that we're in, which is that for many years now, the city has decided to basically kick that can down the road and not invest in the state of good repair. What that means is they are planning to defer repairs to the system that literally millions of people rely on every day. And that makes the system less reliable, more prone to breakdown and delay, and even in some cases compromises safety. And I'm not going to suggest for a second that the folks of the TTC would ever knowingly endanger someone, but if safety is at issue, they have to shut down the system. If you've ever been caught in one of those terrible, breakdowns that abandon you in rush hour, you know how disruptive that can be. If you don't keep up with basic maintenance and repair, you will have more of that. The current plan is for, if you look at just the chart, it's like the easiest chart in the world to read. We go from a backlog of necessary state of good repair, maintenance and repairs, and it just goes up and up and up over that within 10 years, having a $6 billion backlog. That's not building back better. That is literally a plan to decline. That is literally planning for the system to not be maintained to the standard it should be. So we really need a massive investment in transit in order to have any chance of coming out of the pandemic with a strong economy and a better city that everyone can thrive in. I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Tricia. And again, to everybody, if things are occurring to you, questions you want to ask, comments you want to make based on what you're hearing from our panel or anything else, please remember to put them in the chat as we're going so that we don't lose them. Next, I'm going to ask Abigail Doris, who is one of the city's leading advocates on childcare, to share a few thoughts about how the childcare system is doing and what we need to do to make sure that it's part of a robust recovery. Abigail?
Yeah. Thanks so much. Apologies for not sharing my camera. I'm having some technical difficulties. And to be fully transparent, there are 4 tiny children who are getting ready for bed right now. So there's a little bit of controlled chaos in the background. But yes, thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it. Like you had mentioned, my name's Abigail Doris. I'm a registered early childhood educator, and I serve as the executive coordinator for the Toronto Community for Better Childcare. So to say that the 2021 was a disappointment, I think would be an understatement for the childcare community. Like many other communities and the communities that are represented here today, we felt like this budget didn't work towards the implied goal of building back a better Toronto. And the childcare system was fragile before the onset of the pandemic, and COVID has really exacerbated the pre-existing crisis that we're experiencing. So for some context there, we've had 27 childcare centers in Toronto permanently over the past 10 months, and there are 38 that remain closed without a reopening date. On a larger scale, more than 130 centers have closed across Ontario. So this is an ongoing trend that we're seeing. And without ongoing stabilization funding, more centers will continue to close. In our membership alone, which are nonprofit childcare centers, we are hearing from centers that within the next 3 to 5 months, without significant stabilization funding, they will be forced to close their doors. So the market-based system in which childcare is delivered can't sustain itself in the current climate of low enrollment and financial instability. And the federal government has promised this pan-Canadian publicly funded childcare system. And this is something that advocates have been fighting for longer than I have been alive. I am quickly nearing 40. So to achieve this, we need all levels of government, including the city, to be collaborating to ensure that we can make it to the point of having this system without collapsing before that. And Toronto has a licensed childcare growth strategy, but this was missing from this year's budget. And this strategy was developed to expand childcare and make childcare in Toronto more accessible and affordable for families by 2026. Torontonians pay the highest childcare fees in all of Canada. It's comparable to paying a second mortgage or a second rent each month. And pre-pandemic, we only had enough childcare spaces to provide care for roughly 30% of children ages 0 to 6. So it's critical that we stay committed to this growth strategy and that we work to expand it. Families have been hit hard by the pandemic. Families are experiencing job losses and precarious work and housing insecurities. Since 2020, Toronto's waitlist for childcare fee subsidies has ballooned to more than 23,000 children. That's an increase of more than 48% from the previous year. So our city needs to address this through transformative. It can't be a Band-Aid solution. It can't be a one-time thing. We need significant policy changes to support the growing needs of families. And when we lose nonprofit childcare centers, we don't get them back. It's not the same with the ongoing school closures that we're experiencing. There is a dramatic impact there, and there's a rippling effect with that. Access to affordable childcare is critical for families. So parents and caregivers being able to remain or re-enter the workforce. And there are ties to accessible childcare and stabilizing our economy. And we've heard so much for the last year about a feminist recovery, a she-covery, if you will, as the term that's been circulating. And women have disproportionately been forced out of the workforce throughout the pandemic. And the inequity is experienced further by Black, Indigenous, and racialized women. So with this proposed budget, how is the city prioritizing their reentry to the workforce? How is the city supporting their ability to engage in the local and broader economy? It's really not. It feels like we're moving backwards. And I think more importantly, and it doesn't come up, but I'm thinking about children when I'm looking at this budget. And I think that they're underrepresented in this budget completely, both young children and youth. And I get it. They're not old enough to vote. They're not property owners. They're not taxpayers, but they need us to fight for them. Children have the right to access early learning and care, like full stop. And no matter where they live, no matter their community. And if we aren't a city that's prioritizing the social, emotional, and developmental well-being of our youngest citizens, we're not building back in any way a better Toronto. We're failing them. But with all of that said, from this budget, something that is in a different light to take away is that we're taking away lessons of mobilizing. So we're using our disappointment in this budget to fuel our vision of opportunities to collaborate with community partners and allies to work together to. And we're looking at this budget as a moment to launch activism. And actually, Gord, it was you in a meeting that had said that. And I was like, yes, this is what we need to do. This is what we need right now, because this year and this budget is not going to save childcare. We're too far into a crisis that's not what's going to happen right now. So instead, we need to mobilize and organize our community. And that means educators, workers, families, community partners, allies, and all the folks in our neighborhoods. It's really based on building authentic relationships, to move decision makers into action. And I think it's time that we transform how we view childcare. It needs to be a vision of collective care and of community care. And everyone in Toronto depends on somebody who depends on childcare, whether it is directly or indirectly. So building back a better Toronto really is raising the value we place on care and care work and prioritizing communities in their ability to care for each other.
Abigail, thank you so much. I'm just going to keep moving along. We're running a little over time. I'm now going to ask Emma to share a few thoughts on particularly the climate plan or any other environmental issue that she and the good people at the Toronto Environmental Alliance want us to know about.
Thanks so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm sorry that I joined late. It was my first time having major technical issues in the last year, so I guess I'm pretty lucky in that sense. But yes, I'll keep my remarks short. I think that probably many of the overarching themes that I would have highlighted have been highlighted by previous speakers, and it was good to hear Abigail and Patricia. What I will say is that I think given where we're at with the pandemic, and we've heard about, very, very significant crises that our city has been facing for a long time around housing, transit, and childcare. I think the same is true when it comes to climate, which is what I'll speak about, which one crisis doesn't override another. We have to look at wholesale strategic approaches to address multiple issues in our city. And we do have to have pinpointed interventions, whether they're in the form of policy programs or investments that address multiple challenges, particularly as previous speakers have highlighted, for folks who face ongoing inequity and exclusion. So I'd say that is the most important thing to consider. Specifically when it comes to climate, I think the sort of foundation for what the Toronto Environmental Alliance is looking at in this budget really goes back to when the city in 2019 in the fall passed a climate emergency declaration. And that was very significant. T and collaborators, both outside of council, inside of council, and civil society, really pushed hard on this. And we won some very significant things. And I'll just highlight a few of those. One, it outlined a path for the city to actually get to net zero, so to stop making climate pollution by mid-century or as early as 2040. It committed the city to accelerate that path, particularly through strategies around housing and transit, which are so critical to our city. It committed the city to developing a low carbon job strategy, with a decent work agenda, and including creating pathways for equity seeking groups. And a very important commitment to more meaningfully involve Indigenous peoples in decision-making around our climate strategy, Transform TO, and have a climate lens applied to all major decisions, including investment decisions of the city. So this was not insignificant. It created a really strong foundation for moving forward. And what we've seen since, and understandably so with the pandemic, there's been a lot of delays in terms of the city coming back with the plan, the next stage of our climate strategies, Transform TO implementation plan, which is supposed to run from 2021 to 2023, coming back with a plan that really encompassed a lot of the commitments that were made in the climate emergency declaration. And so now, as much as we recognize that certain delays were inevitable, it is time to get back on track. And we need a budget that actually moves us to action on the climate emergency. And one of the things that we were very concerned about at T is that the division that is largely responsible for climate action, environment and energy division at the city, did see a decrease of about 17% in terms of what was originally planned for 2021 in its budget. And we do know that we need staff, particularly to move a lot of these important pillars of the climate strategy. And we need the plan linked to the climate emergency to be forthcoming in a timely way so that when they lay out what that pathway is to get to net zero and the investments that are necessary, we get that in on time to feed into the 2022 budget cycle. So we need to keep looking ahead. We can't just keep delaying and kicking the can on the road even further. particularly when we have this tremendous opportunity to make investments in climate action that also support many of the other areas that have already been mentioned in this forum. So we know that we need green, affordable, and stable housing as a dire need in this city. We know that climate investments, particularly in social housing and residential buildings, for example, can really improve the quality of life for folks if they're done right, if they're done without the risk of displacement or eviction. And we know that we can have tremendous economic growth and shared wealth if we have a strong green job strategy that really extends the opportunities we know that come with building green infrastructure or retrofitting, buildings, making things energy efficient to folks who may be experiencing climate barriers and many other people. If we do this right, it can really be a pathway out of where we are now and address many of the intersecting crises that our city faces. So when we look to residents to engage, I think there's a really important role for people to voice these demands. We saw a lot of great deputations on climate and intersecting areas like housing and transit. And it's really important, I think, that council hear these voices in a sustained way, because we've really moved the needle over the last couple of years, and we need to keep moving to it.
Thank you so much, Emma. So I'm just going to arbitrarily jump in and change our agenda a little bit. We had meant to have a 10 or 15 minute conversation between the panelists now, but we ran about 10 or 15 minutes over. So I'm going to go to questions that are coming from members of the public who are here with us tonight. Some of them I'll just deal with because there's no one here who has that expertise. Some of them maybe we'll try to get a conversation going. The first set of questions that I've seen have to do with the City of Toronto Police budget and our outstanding need to defund the police, or as some people now talk about it, detask the police. We had a terrible, terrible loss last summer in our community. Regis Korchinski-Paquette, a sister of ours who lived in the neighborhood, died when her family called with an emergency mental health crisis at their home when the police arrived. Between that and another, believe it or not, dozen similar deaths in the Greater Toronto area over the last year, and the Black Lives Matter work that we have seen right around the world now, we had a debate at council about taking money away from the police and putting it into the kinds of services that keep people stable so that they don't need police intervention or deal with community safety using people who are not wearing body armor and carrying a gun. Unfortunately, although many of us on council supported that approach, that was not the approach taken. Instead, what we got was a proposal that came to council just this month to spend $1.7 million, so less than 2% of the police budget, studying a plan to do some pilot projects that may divert some calls that come into the police from the police to mental health workers in 3 parts of the city, and then to consider maybe implementing a citywide program in 5 or 6 years. It's completely inadequate. It's completely unacceptable. And there are 2 thoughts I want to leave people with about this. The first is, in a province where we do not have a mental health care system that provides real supports to the people who need it, where we do not have a housing system that actually houses people, where we are creating barriers to people entering the workforce by not having a transit system or a childcare system. How is it that we wind up always increasing the budget for the force that is called to people in crisis? it's almost like it's all like if you were looking at it from 1,000-foot view, you might even conclude that it's on purpose. Starve people of the tools that they can use to build a good life, and then when things go wrong in their community, respond with police cars, body armor, and guns. That's the first thought. The second thought is this is one of the very many places where the roles and responsibilities of different orders of government have to be realigned. In Ontario, it is actually the law that the Police Service Board, half of the members of which are appointed by the province of Ontario, can go to the province of Ontario and say, the city is not giving us enough money to do our job. And they can overturn any budget approved by the City of Toronto if that provincially appointed body agrees with them. I sat on the city's budget committee for 4 years ago, and every year that threat was made by senior command and the members of the Police Service Board when we were reviewing their budget. This is one of the ones that we have to build a different model, and that means building different expectations, and that means organizing politically to get to that better system. Those are a couple thoughts on the police budget, and just I want to again add my undertaking that piece by piece we need to take away things that the police are doing and invest that money into providing people with the actual help that keeps them safe, secure, and well in our city. The next question that came up, could we get some specific information about what this budget does to already approved transit projects? I'm just going to look at Tricia and see if she turns her microphone on. There she goes.
I can. Sorry, what was the question? What does it do to existing projects?
Yeah.
I mean, not much. I'm assuming you mean capital projects. Not much. Those are slowing down and being delayed and going over budget and so on all by themselves. They were already doing that, and this budget doesn't really change them. The capital funding of transit is kind of an evolving thing at the moment. If this is something you follow, you may know that over the last couple of years, there have been a number of, let's say, challenges from the province about decision making around that, and they've effectively taken over that process, and in many instances said that they will pay for things. But I mean, there's not much. The most significant part, I suppose, of the budget, and Gord can probably speak to this better than I can, but it would be the separate office that the city holds that does the liaising with those projects, which is the Transit Expansion Office, which has a fairly significant budget for what it does, but it's not such a large budget that that's where you would be searching for major efficiencies or anything. So there's not a big impact. I do think it's an opportunity as we review the finances to revisit some of those decisions. The gardener, I believe Victor mentioned, would absolutely be one that it'd be great if we revisited that, because that is a huge chunk of the transport infrastructure budget for the city for the next while. It's just embarrassing. If you do a cost-benefit analysis of, first of all, how many people use that and benefit from it, what the impact of not rebuilding it is, which is absolutely minimal, and how it in fact improved the city to go back to the original plan. But none of that's really in the budget. What's missing actually is the ability to make new plans, not in terms of major capital infrastructure, like major infrastructure, but more in terms of expanding service.
Yeah, and just to add one little thought on that last point Tricia made, a little bit over a year ago, the TTC brought us a 5-year service plan, And essentially what it said is, if you want to carry people even as well as you're doing it now, you have to go buy a whole ton of buses and streetcars.
Mhm.
And the current budget does not assume we are buying all those buses and streetcars that plan required. So it's actually built into this budget that transit service is not going to get better, it's going to get worse. That's built in. That's an assumption in this budget. Just looking through the next question. Sarah Doucette, who's here, has asked, what is the property tax increase proposed for 2021? How much actual money does this represent on a family home? What property tax rate would Gord be recommending for 2021? Sarah always asks me the easy questions. So the property tax rate proposed on residential homes is a 0.7% increase. So 0.7 of 1 percentage point. The cost to an average family home in the city of Toronto is about $22 a year for that increase. The increase on industrial and commercial properties is 0.35%, half. There is a rule that for rental properties, there will be a 0 property tax increase. Remember, that's the property tax paid by the landlord. In terms of what I would propose, so Sarah's asking this because every year for the last 11 years, I have moved a motion to increase the property tax of the city of Toronto. This year I'm struggling with whether that's what I want to do because, as I pointed out, our problem is in the $1 billion range. If you increase property taxes by 1%, that generates $40 million. That means that I would have to be moving a 25% property tax increase to address the kind of problems that you've heard discussed tonight. I don't think I'm going to be moving a 25% property tax increase, and I don't think that if I did move it, I would get very many votes. I think this is a year when we have to recognize that we need a new deal for how cities work. The last time cities were in a moment like this was the Great Depression. And in the Great Depression, about a third of the municipalities in Canada went bankrupt. They literally could not pay their bills. So the federal government responded by saying, we are going to invent 2 new programs. One of them is unemployment insurance, because municipalities can no longer bear the cost of housing, feeding, and taking care of people who've lost their jobs. That used to be jointly done by charities and municipalities. And we are also going to create a housing plan for the country. And for the first time, the federal government started paying money to build housing. Going to Victor's point, which is that when you build it, you're making an investment. And there is nothing in the world wrong with governments investing in a way that makes money. I always say to people, why is it that everyone in the world can make money in the Toronto real estate market, except for the government of Toronto? So I just bear that in mind. I think we're in a moment like that. You've heard about how fundamental systems are breaking in the city of Toronto: housing, transit, childcare, our ability to prevent to the extent that we can and deal with the changes that climate change are going to bring to our city. These incredibly fundamental things to how cities work can't be managed off the property tax. We need a new deal. I want you to remember that. And here's how I think we should have written our budget. We're just asking the federal government, give us $865 million so we can build back a little bit worse. Why don't we ask them for $2 billion so we can save every child care center, house every person, buy every vehicle that we need, and implement a climate plan that actually gets us to net zero. And here's the thing, it costs the federal and provincial government more if someone can't get to work because they don't have childcare and they don't have transit. The federal government has to write that person a check, or the provincial government, if it's Ontario Works, that is more than the cost of childcare, housing, and transit for a day. In other words, we should be telling the federal government the only way you can save money is to prevent the economic collapse, keep people working, get people housed, and deal with the climate crisis. That's the budget we should have asked those other orders of government for. And that's what I'm going to be continue to campaign for. Okay, let me just look at the next question. Actually, I'll just throw that open to the panel. Any comments or thoughts on that way of thinking? Oh, just unmute, go wild.
Yeah, I want to jump in on that because it's the same, it's very much the case for transit. And one of the things we absolutely need to do here is shift the framing of it, because so much of the language is about, you know, we don't have the money, we don't have the money. And first of all, this is a very wealthy city and a very wealthy country. It could make better decisions about how it spends it. But also, it thinks wrongly about how the economy succeeds, right? You can't have a healthy economy if you don't look after climate change, because that costs you big time. And you can't have a functioning economy if you don't have childcare, because women in the workforce is not some kind of hobby, it's actually an essential part of the economy. And it's the same thing with transit. It's like saying, well, I'm saving money by not buying gas for my car to get to my job, which will make me much more than the gas, right? Like, if you don't have people move around, the economy just isn't there. Like, that's what generates the wealth in the first place. These are all investments that pay you back in spades. And there's so much research that says that housing pays you back, the childcare pays you back, the transit pays you back. It is foolish to not invest in these, and because we can't afford it. And I agree about not asking for a 25% property tax increase, but it is also a reality that by and large, you know, relative to the rest of the region, the city region that we're in, Toronto's property taxes are low. And I do think as part of the New Deal, we need to rethink, you know, how taxes are collected and to make sure that all of the sources of revenue are as progressive as they can be. We cannot run the city off property taxes, but we can have a conversation about a fairer property tax system in the context of a fairer funding system that, for example, doesn't rely on the fare box to fund transit as it predominantly does. It is riders paying 70%, and then the city paying most of the rest of that pays for transit, that you know, generates so much wealth, not just for the city but for the whole province.
Thanks. Any other comments from the panel? Abigail, I have a question for you. One of the people participating in the meeting tonight has asked me, as a mother that has pulled her child out of daycare during the pandemic, is there something I should be doing to help the center right now?
Oh, thank you so much, Gord. And also thank you to the person who wrote that comment. I can't find it in there, but thank you for sharing that. I actually have a couple of actions that you can participate in right now that can help childcare centers across the city and even across Ontario. I'll put both of the links in the chat for folks to participate in. We've partnered with Progress Toronto on a petition. And there's also something that you can do through the Ontario Coalition for Better Childcare and the Association of Early Childhood Educators Ontario. It's an open letter to the province. But what you can do as a family for your childcare center is they're a part of your community. And they are likely feeling the exact way that you're feeling right now. And I think connecting with them as an individual and building that relationship and leaning into that relationship is first and foremost the most important thing to do. Childcare centers care so much about the families that we work with and so much about the families who don't have access to childcare. Above and beyond that, Absolutely. Get involved. Come and participate in town halls like this. Ask questions, hold your decision makers accountable. But I do have 2 actions that you can participate in right now. Anyone else who is interested?
Maybe I could ask each of our panelists if they've got a moment, an idle moment while the conversation's going on. If you have an organization or a campaign, there it goes. Just put a link to it in the chat so that everybody has it. If there's anything else that you want to share later on, we did harvest emails from people participating today, and we can forward them further information that you have later on. The next question I have, I keep getting, I don't know, I think I've developed a reputation. I'm getting questions about public finance. The next question I have is, why doesn't the city ask the province for the right to borrow to pay for its operating costs? Okay, I'm going to try to do this in under 3 minutes, and I'm very sorry. And anyone who's not a public finance nerd, you might want to mute the volume and put on a piece of music you enjoy. So there are different ways that governments borrow money. Issuing debt is one of them. Municipality, and then there are ways that municipalities pay that off. Because municipalities rely on the property tax, and the property tax, the value of properties doesn't necessarily match economic growth. Sometimes it gets completely out of whack. Like for a while, we've seen property values grow much, much faster. In the United States, after the global financial crisis, they saw the value of properties in a lot of places, I'm thinking of Miami as an example, plummet. So the only way municipalities who rely on the property tax can manage when an economy is shrinking is to basically cut all their services, because they have no way to recover the debt and recover the money and pay off the debt that they incur operating services. The federal government does get money out of the economy quickly because it has the income tax. They also have the ability through the Bank of Canada to print money, which is the province of Ontario borrows money and the federal government buys it from them and then pays it off with future revenue. We can literally borrow from ourselves. And economists are saying right now, that's the way out. When an economy is shrinking, governments should be giving people money, literally printing it and giving it to them, either directly, as we have through CERB, or better still, by building childcare, building housing, and building transit. Because when you do that, you both are buying services that put people to work, and you're giving people the way to get to work. And then when they're at work, they pay income tax, and that pays off your debt. And that is so much smarter than asking municipalities to go into debt. So all of you who don't care about public finance can turn your volume back up now, and we'll go to a question that is less specialized. What do we got next? There's a question about green bonds. Okay, I'm gonna, Emma, do you know much about green bonds? Would you like to talk about that a little bit?
Gord, actually, I'm not an expert in green bonds, but I would say that just overall, I think it's really important that there's a full range of revenue tools for climate in green bonds, which the city, as far as I've understood it, has done fairly successfully a few times. But I'll let you elaborate on that. I will use this moment to say, though, just to emphasize the point that you brought up earlier, which is things like addressing climate change on the scale that we require really do need some sort of new deal. And at the very least, the provincial and federal governments to come to the table what I think we need to see from the city is the kind of vision that will command governments to come to the table, even higher orders of government, so that they're actually investing in something transformative, particularly when it comes to economic recovery and advancing climate change. So the kind of low carbon job strategy that we got in the climate emergency declaration could be transformative at this time when we're trying to get people back to work. And we're looking at transforming our buildings and transit infrastructure, for example. So sorry, that didn't directly answer the question. I'll let you speak to the green bonds, but I did want to interject.
No, that actually was helpful. It's probably better that people not listen to me talk about debt financing tools all night. I even put myself to sleep sometimes. Here's a question that I've got that I want to just throw open to the panel. I'm getting tired of hearing about how all these services have already been underfunded. COVID has only exacerbated these issues. Aside from writing and calling our representatives, calling them out on social media, which happens, activism, protests, marches, etc. None of that has seemed to work. What do we need to do? Can't believe it. I've got 4 activists on my panel. I expected all the microphones to get turned on right there. I'm just going to pick Victor and make him start answering that.
I'm going to do that terrible thing, Gord, and say repeat the question.
Basically, Victor, the question is, you know, many of us here have been writing our politicians for years and years and years, or doing this. What do we need to do to get these problems solved? How do we do it? How do we as citizens make this change?
Well, I think that, I mean, and Gord, I don't know how many of these budget town halls back when we did them in person, that you know, I've been a party to. And we know that over the years, there's been this sort of real divide between the parts of the city that have and are pretty comfortable and are probably the ones that are working from home, and the parts of the city that are not, and are on the buses that are overcrowded. And you know, the real trick, and I do think that there's some really good activists and a bit of a shift that's been happening. And Surge has done great work. So we know that Surge is right now focused on policing and you know, changing the way that the policing budget is to be allocated, and they're fabulous activists. I think that there's a bit of work that needs to be done in rethinking who it is that needs to hear this message. Because, Gord, you've got a bunch of your constituents, and, you know, the difficulty is that you're telling them actually the province is in charge of all of the rules about policing in the city. And, gee, you know, the feds actually have all of the access to the financing. And so I think that we need to be really clear about we have the most access to you as a municipal representative, but we actually need to be pushing the other levels of government and showing up and telling them what it is that we need. The right now, your access is great, that, you know, you're willing to have these town halls, and to I know that you meet with a variety of groups in Ward 4, but the real piece is that you have limited tools, and that we as constituents and activists need to understand which lever we need to pull. And, you know, quite frankly, I think we could be focusing a bit on the province, although it's a little bit of a harder push right now. But I do believe that federally there's a Liberal government that is in a minority, and in fact, you know, have been trying to manage getting money out into the economy to solve some of the problems that we've been hearing tonight. And we need to actually go to those representatives and provide them the kinds of vision that we're talking about here tonight. We need investments, and we need to be able to make that well, and we need to understand who it is that we're talking to and why they need to make these changes. So that would be my take on this, but I would love to hear what Patricia, Abigail, and Emmy say.
I saw Trisha's hand go up.
Yeah, I think I want to say that all that stuff does work. The problem is we have to keep doing it. It doesn't sort of work and stick but nothing does. Nothing, is going to stick permanently in the way that we want. But like right now in Alberta, there was an effort by the current provincial government to reopen coal mining in the Rocky Mountains, something that had been closed down for almost 50 years. And it is from a climate change point of view, it was an outrageous thing. And there was a public outcry. And there was a petition signed by something like 100,000 people. And there were a bunch of local councils that were, in the immediate area who passed motions against it, like all that kind of usual activist stuff where councils just pass resolutions that they have no control over it. And people just sign a paper. And the government has backed down and is completely reversing course, and in fact even acknowledging that, whoa, that was a mistake, which governments never do. That's a majority government. They don't have to listen to anybody really if they don't want to.
It's also Jason Kenney.
It is, who's not known for listening to opinions he doesn't like, but like that stuff works. It doesn't always work, and it doesn't always work as fast as we want it to, but and I certainly am familiar with the sentiment of like, what do we need to do? Nothing seems to work. But I think we also need to focus on the fact that activism does work, activism in multiple forms, and you never really know, what's gonna be the tipping point, like what's gonna be that last snowflake that falls on the roof that causes the roof to cave in. And so you just have to keep trying on all fronts. But the Alberta lesson in the last few days has been a really interesting one, that shows how even very simple, not even sort of what I would call radical resistance can succeed.
Emma, do you have a thought here?
Yeah, I would definitely agree that Victor and Tricia have already said. I think it's really important to think about policy durability. So movements are powerful. I think in the past year, we've just seen like the culmination of years of work around racial justice actually starting to shift things. Not nearly enough, but things are moving. And I think we also need to interrogate the question of how do we create policy durability through building diverse, broad-based movements. And even in specific neighborhoods where we might, I'll just use the climate organizing as an example, we might have very strong climate advocacy. Climate activists need to take the time to meet other people where they are, and connect the dots to other important issues like the ones we've spoken about today. Often what I find sometimes when people are singularly focused on one issue, let's say it's an environmental issue in this case, is that they feel that there isn't time for the process of community building. And so they just want to go straight to the policy change, but they don't spend a lot of time with folks that may not have the same kind of livelihoods, or in some cases privilege as they do. And when governments change and policy regimes come in and out, and we wonder why people don't stand up for those things. Well, they may not stand up for those things because they don't see how they interconnect with their lives and their immediate concerns and priorities. So I'd say even in neighborhoods and wards where we've got really great momentum on some of these issues, I think there's still a lot more work to be done in the process of engaging other people and really building movements across, and always keeping in mind that we should target decision makers, but we have to, walk all together, and there's a lot more work that needs to be done.
Abigail, do you have a thought on this?
Yeah, I want to echo what Emma has just said about community building. That's been a huge focus for the childcare community in amplifying the voices of our families and of our educators and childcare workers. It's been an uphill battle since forever for childcare, and the fact that we have economists talking about the importance. I don't know an educator or childcare who got into our field because they wanted to help the economy. That's not why we do what we do, but it was through creating allies and community partners and building power within our movement that we were able to get folks who might be seen as opponents or unlikely allies to move you and shift what they were thinking and what they were seeing to see the value of what we were doing. And it's been really frustrating. I will be honest and agree with you. It's hard. It feels really hard when you are fighting every day as hard as you possibly can for children and families. And for in our community, the early learning and childcare workforce, like more than 40% of folks in my sector don't make a living wage. It's really hard, but we keep going, even when it's hard, even when it feels like no one is listening. There was a lot of motions put forward at the city budget, and two of those motions that were passed were childcare motions. Seem really, really small, but for us, that was a small victory that gives us more room to push further. Um, our provincial government does not care for childcare. They've made it very clear. We have brought them every piece of evidence, wonderful pieces that have been in full consultation with our sector and with families, and they continue to ignore the majority of our calls. But if we can get in at the city level and push the city to push for us and champion for our cause, it gives us more momentum to continue to ask folks in our community to fight alongside with us. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
These are really, really wonderful points. I'm just noting, though, that we're coming towards the end of the time that we set. And I just want to say a couple things to maybe conclude the conversation. First of all, you know, my own thought on, you know, activism, does it work and so on. I think it's very simple. Activism doesn't always work, but nothing else ever has worked. There is literally no piece of social progress that people with wealth and power have ever just handed over because they thought it was the right thing to do. We only get change when we make it impossible not to have that change. In the chat, someone asked, you know, what do I advise about moving some of my colleagues on council to change their view? There's only one thing that will make them change their view: if you make them uncomfortable. If every day when they're talking to their staff, how many calls did I get today? The number is very big. And what was the topic of the calls? Well, people think you're wrong about ... That's the only way it's ever going to work. And part of doing that, as MA and Abigail both talked about, is doing the work to build the community that can put that pressure on elected officials. It doesn't always work, but nothing else ever does. And with that, I want to thank Victor, Patricia, Abigail, MA for being here tonight, insights, your time. I want to thank everybody from the community who joined us tonight. I can't tell you how much I want to be able to see you all again face to face to do one of these. It's just, these are so stiff and difficult. But thank you for giving us part of your evening to talk about these important issues. And have a great evening. Be safe. Bye now.